out to Socrates. Socrates still trying to get the opening. Oh, Socrates! Whoa!
And there it is. The crazy gang have beaten the Culture Club.
Maggie Thatcher, can you hear me? Maggie Thatcher, your boys took a hell of a beating. Your boys took a hell of a beating.
Welcome to Module 4 of Your Boys Took One Hell of a Beating, our new 1980s venture, where we will defiantly stick ourselves to the 1980s. Very much, a touch of Open University meets Channel 4, dispatches, right to reply, all that type of stuff. Things that are very much trenchantly of the 1980s. Every second counts, maybe. The much loved or much derided quiz show from I think who was that one? Was that? I always got them mixed up. I think it was Paul Daniels, wasn't it?
Bob's Full House was Monkhouse.
Bob's Full House. That was the other one.
I'll never ever understand what the word "walled" mean. You're walled. You can't answer this. I don't know if it was a real word or just a Bobism.
I don't even remember that Bobism there. I remember the program, but I don't remember the terminology there.
Yeah, so if you got a question wrong, you'd say you walled. You can't answer this, as it got offered to the other contestants. If anyone knows the origins of that word, then please do let me know.
Well, that's where my YouTube viewing's going tonight. Bob's Full House. Welcome, Chris Lepkowski. Looking forward to this one. We're not going to be able to watch much football today. In this one, I don't think we'll be throwing out too many YouTube klaxons, although there is one or two out there that can be pointed to. Chris, give us your topic of choice for Module 4.
Well, I'm looking at a blank screen because 1985-86 was one of the most exciting title dices in First Division history, but it was also a title dice that for half a season none of us saw because, in their wisdom, the TV companies, that being BBC and ITV, could not come to an agreement with the Football League. And so we had a situation where between August 85 and January 1986, there was absolutely no league football screened. And in fact, unless the clubs actually had their own in-house camera teams, there is actually not much footage at all of this period, which is a bit of a blow if you're a Man United fan and you missed the team winning their first 10 games on the bounce. If you're a West Bromwich Albion fan, whose team actually just took 1 point from the opening 10 games, then it was a sheer relief. But there were lots of teams in between, lots of clubs in between who had some interesting seasons. And unfortunately, if you weren't actually at the stadium on the day, you didn't see the game. And a lot of, I wonder how many fans were lost to football during this period. But that's a discussion for another time. I think it was a curious period of politics between the TV broadcasters and the Football League. And
as part of this, we will come to the mysterious Frank McAvenny that apparently only London taxi drivers and that knew south of Hadrian's Wall. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of background to this. A lot of build up to this tipping point, this flashpoint. You can go way back. Football on television. Mid to late 1930s. The birth of the BBC, the first FA Cup final broadcast in 1938, Preston North End versus Huddersfield Town. The infamous game in which who was the commentator? That's Tommy Woodruff, who was the plummy, well-to-do BBC commentator that was clearly the inspiration behind Harry Enfield's endless BBC style skit, who did the commentary that day, and it's not available. It's not on record anymore. But he 119 goalless minutes. He declared that if there was a winning goal scored now, he would eat his hat. Only for Preston to be awarded a penalty, and the goal to be scored. He was later filmed eating a hat in the style of a cake to fulfil his prophecy somewhat. Woodruff, just another. I'll give a Tommy Woodruff klaxon here. would be seek out his commentary of it was a naval display that was well worth looking at. That is available on YouTube, and he is absolutely rotten drunk as he does it. It's a cold day down on the Solent, and he is doing the commentary of this I don't know, this naval kind of display, and it's just a work of magnificent art. Beyond that, then into beyond the Second World War, we have there's the birth of ITV in the mid 1950s. They're quick to embrace the sport. They simulcast the FA Cup final for the first time in 1956. And from the 1960-61 season, they actually strike a deal for 26 live Football League games, planned mostly to be shown on Saturday evenings, with a few to be shown on Fridays. But the first one's a bit of a car crash. They position the cameras behind the goals. The commentators are deemed to be too chummy. Peter Lloyd and I think it was Billy Wright. It's Blackpool versus Bolton Wanderers. There's no Stanley Matthews, who's injured. And it's just an absolute disaster. It's an half-empty ground. The game takes place on a Saturday evening. ITV show on the second half of the match. And from that point, all club chairmen up and down the country, they give short shrift to ITV cameras invading the football grounds, and it all falls apart. And from the BBC are the dominant force for the remainder of the decade. They do coverage of the 1962 FA Cup final, but only in delayed format. Satellite television is still in its intimacy. It's not got that. You can't beam these games directly from Chile. So tapes are ferried back to London, which are broadcast 48 to 72 hours later. There's the 1966 FA Cup, 1966 World Cup that they both cover. So the BBC become the watchword, but by the 1970s, ITV are a much more, they're much more on the ball, for want of a better pun. They are no longer the poor relation to the BBC. The two operate in this near cartel, apart from occasional closed circuit camera, broadcast operations that are short lived. And, they kind of go toe-to-toe. They're in cahoots with each other, but they go toe-to-toe. The BBC poached Jimmy Hill in 1972 to front match of the day, having been a staple of the big match. The BBC even, sneak in on the blind side of ITV and discuss the prospect of live Football League games in the 1970s with the Football League, which is, something of an issue with ITV, who respond in November 1978, in absolutely magnificent style by signing an exclusive 3-year contract with the Football League without the BBC's knowledge, under the gaze of Snatch of the Day, the Big Snatch. Michael Grade, who would later go on and be the head, the focal point of the BBC with ITV at that point in time, John Bromley. They in the come, but there's a bit of a, there's some kind of contractual dispute over it. The Monopolies Commission overturn it, and it all goes back to the BBC ITV cartel for the best part of another decade. But the big tipping point's 1983. Chris, this is where a new contract comes in. It leans towards live games more. The TV companies see highlights as being old hat. 1980, 81, 81, 82, 82, 83. I think 79, 80 as well, had all been done in a way of kind of like it battered back and forth between the BBC and ITV having the Saturday night slot. So you had these peculiarities of 1980, 81, 1982, 83, where match of the day was on a Sunday afternoon, the big match was on a Saturday night, which upset the viewers' apple cart for a bit. But then 1983, 84 and 84, 85, that finally the wider spread introduction of live games. BBC showing games on a Friday night, ITV on a Sunday afternoon. It wasn't every week by any means. They had 7 Football League games, a handful of FA Cup games. It amounted to roughly 20 live games a season, 83, 84 and 84, 85, with one of those being simulcast. ITV and BBC both showing the FA Cup final. Chris, there is an escalation in this before we get to this volcanic point of the summer of 1985.
Yeah, there is. I mean, just to row back somewhat 30-odd years, beyond that, Sir Stanley Rouse, who was the FIFA, or went on to become the FIFA president, who said that this is the beginning of a great industry, the progress of which depends to a great extent on the cooperation of institutions such as the FA. He's talking about the TV intrusion there, the arrival of TV. And just to give you some context of where we were really, in 1950, which was the final between Arsenal and Liverpool, that was watched by 1 million people. It was estimated to about 350,000 TV licenses. But 1 million people isn't bad, given that only London and Birmingham had TV coverage at that point. Now, if you go forward to 1953, what did we have? That particular year, we had the Queen's coronation. And a lot of people are investing in TVs. There's been a bit of a post-war boom. So people are starting to find a lot of work and employment. Disposable income is becoming available and people are investing in TVs or renting TVs. And of course, we have the coronation to look forward to, Queen Elizabeth II that year. So people are getting ready for this huge event. Now, the BBC decided that the ideal dry run for that coronation would be to screen the 1953 FA Cup final, which was about 4 weeks before the coronation. The game has been mythologised since. Sir Stanley Matthews was a star of the show. Stan Mortensen got a hat-trick. But it was also the first game where a lot of transmitters had been dropped around the country. So you had transmitters in the north, you had them in Scotland, you had them in the northeast, and all of a sudden it became a national occasion. And much like people of our age maybe talk about 1992 being a seismic moment in English football in the modern era, 1953 was very much that seismic moment in the relationship between TV and football. I mean, if I was to say to you who won the 1952 FA Cup final, you'd probably have to scratch your head, look for it. It was a drab game. Newcastle beat Arsenal. And on that very day, the BBC didn't have rights for the game. They showed a cricket match between Worcestershire and the touring India team. Go forward 1 year to 1953, and 10 million people watched the FA Cup final. So that's where we were really in the 50s. And you mentioned the 1978 snatch of the day. A fascinating dynamic, really. Michael Grade was the director of programmes for London Weekend Television, and he'd already taken Bruce Forsyth from BBC to ITV. Bruce Forsyth was regarded as the
Morecambe and Wise as well.
Yeah, so he'd snatched already the main entertainers that the BBC, that were all about the BBC, and platformed them on ITV. So he started negotiating with a guy called Jack Dunnett, who was the chairman of Notts County, but he's also the league's negotiator. And these weren't public meetings. These were very much clandestine arrangements where they spoke. And Michael Grade offered $5 million over 3 years for the exclusive rights to football highlights. Now, this is 1978. Okay, so effectively, the cost of the rights had increased from 420,000 to 1.6 million. BBC were furious when this emerged. They started legal proceedings on the breach of contract. And as Cliff Morgan, the BBC head of outside broadcasting, said, it wasn't so much a defeat for the BBC, it was deceit. That's how it was felt. But there were two things proven by the snatch of the day in 1978. One was that football was better as a live TV product than highlights. It could be made into an event. And the second one was that actually, when the BBC and ITV aren't running as a cartel, when they're separate, then actually the value of football goes up. So that was 1978. Now, there was another issue around this time that led into 1983. In 1983, the BBC and the ITV made a joint bid of 5.2 million to allow them to show alternative live coverage either on a Saturday night or Sunday afternoon. They were seeing what was happening in the big European leagues where TV companies paid for the privilege of showing live games. And they could see that there was a product, an event to showcase. Now, there was another player who came in, a firm called Telejector Video Communications Limited, catchy title. They were owned by the London and Liverpool Trust, and they were offering £8 million for the rights to broadcast coverage of games to 5,000 specifically installed screens in pubs, clubs, hospitals, schools and colleges. Basically, any community estate was targeted. And this appealed to the clubs on several fronts. Firstly, the money was huge. It was unprecedented, £8 million. And secondly, and this was a big thing, in 1979, Liverpool became the first club to have a shirt sponsor in the Football League. But ITV and especially BBC resisted that. So what you had up until 1983 was teams would have two shirts. They would have a TV shirt without a sponsor and a shirt for non-TV, which did have a sponsor. So this Telejector offer wasn't concerned about shirt sponsorship. That appealed to the clubs. And of course, the fact that it was being shown in community places like pubs, clubs, when there wasn't really a culture for watching football that way, meant that they knew they could get more money but reduce the TV audience. So potentially more people would still want to come to the matches. Now, the league agreed to this tacitly, but they agreed to it. And unfortunately, Telejector withdrew from the negotiations. And that led to a situation where BBC and ITV, as part of their cartel, offered no more money that year, but they did make a concession on shirt sponsors for the 1983-84 season, provided the sponsors were reduced in size. So all of a sudden, instead of talking about Liverpool, Manchester United, Everton, Tottenham, Arsenal, Aston Villa, we're talking about Crown Paints, Sharp, Hafnia, Holston, JVC, Mitre Copiers, the brands that we came to associate with the clubs around then. So 1983 was a real seismic swing. And then, of course, we get to 1985.
We do indeed. The Football League and BBC and ITV were discussing this contract. It would eventually take 15 months. From first kind of like informal discussions to the eventual signing of the contract, December 1985. So this was something that was rumbling from the summer of '84. As you mentioned, Telejector, came into the picture. There'd been other, kind of like pay TV kind of like plans in the 70s and even going back to the 60s as well. Very much kind of like inspired by American systems. Just didn't take off. But 1984 also saw kind of like the birth of screen sport. In the UK, not many people had satellite dishes. Sky Television, kind of formulates around then. They're broadcasting Serie A games in the mid 1980s. This is long before they properly get their act together. But there is this, very much it's tectonic plates at this point in time. But from the summer of 1984, as discussions start to turn their attentions towards the 1985-86 contract moving forward, there is this marked kind of they're both there in their two respective corners. You've got the Football League beginning to play hardball because they've suddenly got the idea that actually we could actually, because what they're doing as well is that they're picking up kind of like transition money from Scandinavia. They're starting to pick up, live games are going on in Ireland. They're selling kind of highlights to Australia that are fronted by Brian Moore. So ITV do a lot of the coverage to be shipped out to other countries at this point in time. That world market is starting to switch on, yet the domestic scene is very much behind the arc here. The BBC and ITV, despite having kind of gone behind each other's backs in the 70s, are still very much feeling that it's them that can call the shots. I mean, interestingly, this is a point in time when prospects of a potential Super League are starting to kick in as well. So the landscape is becoming more volatile, but the BBC and ITV are very much kind of like trenchant in their views that they are still calling the shots rather than the football authorities.
A few things happened during this period. You mentioned Sky there. Well, Sky started off, it was a merchant bank called Guinness Marne and a UK entertainment company, Trident, who started testing transmissions from the orbital test satellite. But there was a relative shortage of people with satellite dishes. I think there were about 50 at that point in the UK. That effectively became Sky TV. Now, at around the point that we're talking about, the new Sky channel was struggling. The owners decided the wait was too costly to implement the transition needed and change the culture, and they sold the company for nominal £1 plus debts. The buyer of that was a guy called Rupert Murdoch. Maybe that's a podcast for another time. But meanwhile, what you've got in England is a problem, because you've got a man on the inside in football now. You've got Robert Maxwell, who's a media man, and he had become the owner of newly promoted Oxford United, and he was the owner of the Mirror Group. He knew that football had a value. He felt football was worth £10 million a season to the TV firms. Now, bearing in mind here that the offer on the table in February 1985 is £3.8 million in a 4-year deal. So 3.8 million in the first year, rising incrementally each year thereafter. Robert Maxwell's claiming 10 million, and he called the offer from the TV companies mad, bad and sad. So we've got this very unusual standoff. Now, the league formed a TV subcommittee, including Maxwell, Tottenham's Irving Scholar, Chelsea's Ken Bates and Norwich chairman Arthur South. And they offered the TV companies 2 packages running over 2 years. The first was for 10 live games, plus the rights to show highlights over 21 weekends. The second was for the League Cup final, or the Mill Cup final as it was, and 2 semi-finals, plus the rights to highlights over 31 weekends. But the TV companies refused to budge. Jonathan Martin, who was the head of sport at the Beeb, said that we'll show snooker instead. And he was justified in saying that, because in 1985, 18.5 million people watched the black ball finish between Steve Davis and Dennis Taylor. So other sports are starting to emerge. And what happens in football? We have the events of spring 1985. We have the Bradford Fire, which shows that our stadia are not fit for purpose. We have a death at St Andrews when a wall collapses on a fan and there's rioting between rival fans. Also at Luton and Millwall, we have similar incidents. And then we have Heysel. Now, Heysel is a big one, because it means that, the tragic element is that 39 football fans die. But the fallout is that overnight, English clubs are withdrawn and banned from European competition. So all of a sudden, football, as opposed to, in contrast to what Robert Maxwell says, football is actually devalued itself with the behaviour of its fans, with the way that stadia are being looked after. So actually, football's not a good place anymore, in a good place. And it was referring back to Mr. Martin from the BBC, who said that we don't depend on football. And if it loses its slot, there is no knowing if it will ever get it back. Now, that seems like an incredible comment to make, given that in 2024, we cannot move for football. Everywhere you turn onto any Sky Sports channel, you will see football. And yet here we were in the throes of 1985, looking, or early 1985, looking ahead to 85, 86, with the realistic prospects of TV and football not being able to agree a fee.
Absolutely. Given that this had rumbled on, like I say, by the time you get to kind of like Heysel, this has been a standoff that's lasted a year. You've got on one hand kind of the Football League, with this product that is very much loved, but it's in a dysfunctional state. They're also looking at, you've got the club chairman that were, very much kind of like over to the States, looking at how they deal with televised sports. The NASL is dying its death, but they're looking at kind of like the NFL, they're looking at Major League Baseball, the NBA, and how it can be done, and when it's done, exceptionally well. But with that juxtaposition, this is an era in which, we only had 3 television channels until 1982, available to all. And within that, 2 of those belonged to the BBC. We all had televisions that, had a button that said ITV2 on it, but, there was no ITV2. That was just there in the eventuality that a 4th channel, which had been long discussed, would eventually tip up. There isn't that, as you say, that competition, for the BBC and IT, valid competition. Yet, the powers that be are looking, they're looking at Italy, they're looking at Spain, live Serie A games since the 1960s, and how everyone else does it. And that but then there is no cross-board consensus, because you literally have 2, not for the one saying warring factions, but two entities, television and football itself, with differing views on what it should be and how much it should cost. This is for it to descend into such a situation, was quite stark. I think as a kid, I remember this popping up on on news programs in the papers on the back pages, because mum and dad would get the Liverpool Echo delivered every night. You grab hold of it, you turn the page over to the back pages, looking to see what who's injured or whatever, and it'd always be there, kind of like TV dispute. It would take eventually 15 months to sort this out, and 30 meetings, and even 7 days, and we'll come to it a bit later on, but even 7 days before a contract is eventually signed. It looks so far away from being a possibility that I think we were likely never to have football back on our screens that season.
2 big figures emerged during this period. Irving Scholar, who became main shareholder of Tottenham in 1982 and actually floated the club in 1984, which was unheard of back then, effectively saw the commercial aspects and the commercial benefits of owning a football club. And just up the road at Arsenal, you had David Dein, who became Arsenal vice chairman in 1983. Now, David Dein, he had family, had connections in the US. He spent a lot of time over there and was bowled over with how the sport was marketed, how they promoted merchandising, how the sports were projected. And he saw that football was left behind. Football wasn't doing that. It was still very much stuck, although technology was advancing, it was still very much stuck in old school ways. There would be no build-up on live matches. You'd literally have 5-10 minutes, you'd announce the teams and off you go. And then at the end, you might have a 5-10 minute discussion. And in between, at half-time, you'd get a bit of hackneyed punditry, no real tactical analysis. It was all a bit low grade compared to what the US was starting to do. Now, Irving Scholar, he approached during this period the advertising agency Saatchi and Saatchi. They were the advertising agency often credited with giving Margaret Thatcher a leg up with the famous Labour's Not Working advert in 1979. Now, Saatchi and Saatchi were effectively commissioned to find out what the football rights are actually worth in England. And they asked one of their executives, Alex Finn, who quite came up with a really simple formula. And he looked at the advertising revenue gained during football broadcasts in the 1983-84 season and how they compared with the advertising revenue during the same period without TV. And the difference was 6 million. So that effectively was the value of football. It was 6 million, which was a lot higher than the 3.6, 3.8 million that the TV companies are offering. Now, actually, Alex Finn became known as the spiritual godfather of the Premier League because it was during this period, on September the 29th, 1985, that Big Five, that being Man United, Arsenal, Tottenham, Liverpool and Everton, met in Birmingham with representatives of Newcastle, Man City, Southampton to discuss a breakaway league because they could see that they were losing this battle. They were getting less and less from the football, from the TV companies. And just to give you a little bit of an insight into why clubs weren't happy. Firstly, the bigger clubs wanted more money. The money was being distributed evenly. So once 300,000 was put into the pot to compensate clubs where attendances had dropped, each team got an equal share of the rest, which was 25 grand. Now, to give you context, when Man United started the European Cup travails in 1956, they got 2,500 per game. So the value hasn't gone up that much. And also, you've got clubs in the fourth division pocketing the same as clubs that appeared on TV and drew in the audiences. Again, the big clubs aren't happy with that. They're the box office clubs. Man United, Liverpool, Tottenham, they were drawing in the audiences, they were drawing in the crowds, 30,000, 40,000, and they felt aggrieved with that, whether you agree with that politically or not. So we had this situation where football felt undervalued from within, that the TV companies were, to put it one way, taking the piss somewhat. And we had the situation where the TV companies, BBC and ITV, shrugged their shoulders and said, well, you've got people rioting in your stadiums, you've got unsafe grounds, you're not even represented in the premier European competitions anymore. You tell us why we should pay you more money for a product that, quite frankly, nobody likes, isn't socially acceptable, isn't particularly popular beyond the masses or the people who watch it on a weekly basis. Why should we bring pictures of people rioting, fighting, empty stands to our viewers? And we had this quite unbelievable standoff between, as I said, August 85, January 1986, where no league football was shown. Imagine that now.
Absolutely. I mean, going back half a generation, I suppose, you're looking at kind of like Alan Hardacre was a big influence on, you know, the I don't know, should we say the stalling nature of certainly live football across the 1970s. Was it 1971 where he stood in the way of the Intercity's First Cup final, second leg, Leeds United versus Juventus, being broadcast in a week in which, you know, the FA Cup final had been on the Saturday, the European Cup final was on the Wednesday, which was at Wembley, so that was live on television, Ajax versus Panathinaikos. Alan Hardacre basically turned down a request from Leeds United and the BBC to cover the First Cup final on the auspices of there's been enough football on television this week. No, and then within that you've got the chairman too, who going back to that 1960-61 standoff. It's the chairman and the directors of clubs that will not allow ITV to put their cameras in their grounds.
Well, Bob Lord was famous. Bob Lord was chairman of Burnley between 1955 and 81, and he viewed TV with utter derision. And he actually turfed out a BBC crew who wanted to show their FA Cup replay against Bournemouth in January 66. He turfed them out, no pun intended, turfed out a turf moor. But Everton were another club who were extremely unwilling to cooperate with TV broadcasters. But I think by the 80s, the culture was changing somewhat, and there was an appetite. England had qualified for the 82 World Cup. That was the period that our clubs were winning European Cups every single year, pretty much, with the exception of 83. And if they weren't winning the European Cup, there was a good chance they were winning the UEFA Cup Winners' Cup. So despite the problems on the terraces, despite the problems in spring 85, there was still, you would feel, an appetite to show football or for people to want to watch football. And yet we've got other sports emerging. I actually spoke to Jim Rosenthal about this recently, who was at ITV at the time. And he said that, it was felt, but he was heading off to athletics or boxing or covering other sports, because back then it wasn't unusual to stick BBC or ITV on and find an athletics meeting from Gothenburg or some speedway from Sweden or from Poland or US, or maybe some wrestling or other sports. Football was in a very competitive market, and it wasn't in a good place. And like I said earlier, 18.5 million people had watched BBC Two on a bank holiday Monday in 1985 to watch Dennis Taylor snatch the world title in snooker on the very last pot of the ball. These were all big sports, and football, as popular as it still was being caught up, and in some cases being overtaken by other sports.
I was one of those 18 million watching that.
Yeah, me too. Yeah,
that Taylor Davis black ball World Championship final. Yeah, I mean that's it. It's the complexity of it all. It's football's view of itself. You've got certain people who can see the potential for growth and what it could and probably should be. You have a lot of people who are still part of the old school. I can remember Bob Paisley, in obviously, he was Liverpool manager till '83, actually kind of like refusing, the cameras, to cover certain games sometimes, and that was still early to mid 1980s. We're talking 82, 83. I can remember them saying, in turning around and saying, and it was BBC or ITV, no, your cameras aren't coming in for this game. We're not having it. So it's an entire mesh of generations and thoughts, because like you say, you got Tottenham with the PLC, you got David Dean and his frequent trips to America to see how it's done. Paul McParland, our friend Paul McParland, took in an NIS game, and having that kind of like culture shock over just what it was like to go and watch a game in America compared to what it was like, the experience was like in the UK of watching football in English football grounds. It's a mad melting pot of opinions, of views, and of willingness.
Well, Jim Rosenthal told me the story of when they finally got back on air, and I'll come on to that very shortly, but when Liverpool-Watford at Vicarage Road was one of the first games to be shown, and he did the transmission with Ian St John, Liverpool legend. And before the match, Ian St John approached Kenny Dalglish and said, Kenny, am I right in thinking this is the team? And Kenny Dalglish went absolutely mental, said, where the F have you got that team from? Who the hell's been telling you things? Now, although that sort of that veil of secrecy still remains to some degree in football, I think it's fair to say that broadcasters now have a better relationship with the managers and are more likely to get a little bit of a steer and actually have to give their teams in advance, so broadcasters work with them. But back then, we've got the unusual predicament of a Liverpool legend in Ian St John approaching another Liverpool legend in Kenny Dalglish and being rebuked for asking him about the team before the FA Cup game at Watford. Now, how did we get to a place where TV shows football again? Well, December 1985, the league finally agreed a 1.5 million deal for the remainder of the season. And the following July, they signed a 2-year deal for 3.1. So both of these are on less favourable terms than the 3.8 million offered in February 85. It was a capitulation by the league. And I think this really, you mention the influence of US sport. I think this really was a catalyst for change, because never again were football club owners going to allow this to happen. This was, in many respects, a year zero in the relationship between broadcasters and football clubs. The football clubs felt like they'd been done over by the TV companies, and they'd had to go cap in hand to try and get football back on screens, and they'd had to accept a really derisory offer compared to the one they'd had in the first place.
I mean, 1984, we talked 1983 and the introduction of the, live games. I can remember watching that first one between Tottenham and Nottingham Forest. ITV did the coverage. The BBC were a little bit slower out of the blocks because of industrial disputes. I think it would be like the November or so before they covered a Man United Arsenal game. I think it was a cracking game. It was all about 4-2. I think it ended to Man United on a Friday night game. But yeah, Tottenham, were very, very forward thinking. They had that. They floated on the stock market. Even before kind of like they did pre-match entertainment. They tried to make it a
Baz
family
and Dave.
event. Baz and Dave and all of that. Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, you did have this mad juxtaposition, but you look at kind of like the summer of 1984, and the backing out of covering the European Championship finals, which was absolutely insane, really, when you come to look at that one. The BBC and ITV had signed their contracts. They'd come to an agreement, even in the wake of there being no British involvement. The BBC were going to show the West Germany group. ITV were going to show the France group. They both showed the semi-final and the final live. ITV just totally backed out of it, basically. They still had their commentators there. Peter Brackley and Martin Tyler went. Brian Moore didn't even bother going. He was sent to South America to cover the England tour, as was Barry Davies for the BBC. John Motson and Alan Parry went to France for the European Championships for the BBC. The BBC covered the Spain-West Germany group game at the Parc des Princes, and they covered the final. And that was it as far as live coverage was concerned. Everything else was just in highlights form. The BBC did have dedicated highlights wherever possible. ITV just simply crowbarred footage into news roundups, midweek sports special, World of Sport, and all of that. It was an absolutely mad summer in that respect. Yet there you were just a few weeks later with both channels covering the Olympics. And there you have the star-spangled banner of an Olympics in LA, where the next Olympic Games will be in 4 years' time. So you had this juxtaposition, this compare and contrast of there's kind of like the second biggest major international tournament in the calendar, just over the channel as well, with these magnificent players, with Platini, with Elchiar, all of these magnificent footballers, involved in it, that played probably the best European Championship ever, blanked by ITV, marginalised by the BBC. And then here's this shiny product of the Olympic Games. In a way, the television companies there and then are kind of hamstringing themselves, because they are broadcasting an Olympic Games that shows just what televised sport can be, while also trying to kind of like, gaslight the Football League and the FA.
I mean, it was a curious relationship that football had with TV organisations. I mean, just as an aside, as we looked at blank screens between August 85 and January 86, ITV actually gave us an extra football programme. It was the summer of 85 that Saints and Greavesy was launched. Now, Ian St John and Jimmy Greaves had been sort of done a little bit of toing and froing as guests of On the Ball, which was a slot during World of Sport, which ran pretty much from about 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning till about 5 o'clock after the football had finished. And World of Sport got decommissioned in 1985. It got scrapped, leaving just Grandstand on BBC One, which was a similar show. So ITV came up with the idea of pairing up Ian St John and Jimmy Greaves in the summer of 85 and letting them launch their own Saturday lunchtime programme, and just calling it Saints and Greavesy. Very easy. Gave it a jaunty theme tune. And they had this really unusual predicament of talking for half an hour about football. Ian St John being the serious guy, Jimmy Greaves being the, shall we say, less politically correct of the two, talking about football that they couldn't show. They couldn't have the rights to, and they couldn't actually show any contemporary football. So what did they do? They did interviews. They used archive footage. They showed other leagues from other countries. And they brought in Jim Rosenthal and Martin Tyler to work on it and interview people and do funny segments, comical segments. And it worked. And here we are in a period where there is no football being shown on TV, no live football, no highlights. And yet on a Saturday lunchtime, you can watch a whole magazine programme about football. And not only that, but it's funny, it's irreverent, it shows football from other countries, and it's also insightful. And as influential as this period was in so many respects for the relationship between TV and football and the rights around football, actually Saints and Greavesy in itself, which was a product of this era, went on to become one of the most influential football programmes of its time and shaped a lot of the stuff that we now see on Sky Sports and have seen on Sky since the early 90s.
It did indeed. I mean, on the other side, literally the other side on BBC, you still had Football Focus, doing its thing. That a more buttoned up, serious kind of alternative. The BBC and ITV would at least bless us by not putting the two up against each other. You would get to watch Football Focus at maybe like 12:15, and then Satan Greavesy from 1 or whatever it was, or vice versa. I can remember the Football Focus leaning a lot into goals from Scotland. You get Eamon Bannon, Paul Sturrock scoring absolute screamers for Dundee United and all that. They were quite blessed that season in terms of it being an interesting Scottish Premier Division season in which Hearts would blow the double, and Alex Ferguson's his Aberdeen were still up and flowing. They'd win the cup that year. Celtic would snatch the title. You had the Rangers trying to get their act together. So and then you also had, like you say, continental goals from here and there wherever they could grab them. We had a lot of British players in Serie A, for instance. We'd see goals. We got to know kind of like that. Incredible Real Madrid side of Butragueño and Michel. Of Martin Vasquez. And all of that. Hugo Sanchez knocking in the goals, and his airplane celebrations and stuff like that. So in a way that lack of English football on the screen was I don't know, it was a breeding ground for the hipsters to come as well. And Saint and Greavesy's show played a part. Now I remember them teaming up on the Ball. Ian St John was the front man of On the Ball. While World of Sport was still going on. And I can remember Jimmy Greaves being interviewed about the birth of Saint and Greavesy and how they kind of came together. And Jimmy Greaves was kind of like roped in to do bits on Tiswas here and there, at ATV at Central, and he would kind of like be on camera, doing a 5-minute segment with the Saint, and in a 20-minute show, and this segment got bigger and bigger. It got longer and longer because the two just kind of like hit it off, had this natural rapport together. So this is how it as ever. A lot of these things kind of have a dot to dot pathway into becoming. But yeah, absolutely. You did have the more light-hearted version on ITV, and you got your serious education over on Football Focus. But the two together worked perfectly together for those who were kind of like we're into the car and off to the football ground once these are finished. So it wasn't the horrendous landscape that you think it should be. I mean, there were occasional games of football shown at this point in time as well. With the FA's part of this deal being slightly different to the Football League, highlights of the 1985 Charity Shield game were broadcast by the BBC the week before the blackout of the Football League started to take effect. England's World Cup qualifiers against Romania, Turkey and Northern Ireland were all shown in highlights formats, batting back and forth on Sports Night and Midweek Sports Special. The system used to be that, they would alternate. ITV, BBC would show an England game and take it in turns through qualifiers and often friendlies as well. No England friendlies at this point in time. The one live game that did make it onto the screens, as far as English TVs were concerned, ITV covered the Wales versus Scotland World Cup qualifier from Ninian Park, a game that took place 24 hours before the England-Romania game, so it was a Tuesday night. 1-1 the game ended, Paul Cooper scoring a late penalty, which was enough to send Scotland into a two-legged playoff against Australia. Again, those games would also be broadcast. I think it was highlights on the BBC of the Scotland-Australia game at Hampden Park. The second leg took place in Melbourne. And I can remember that game. I think it was on STV in Scotland, but Channel 4 showed it. And obviously with the time difference, it was shown midweek, and it was on Channel 4 on a midweek morning on a school day. And I can remember we all crowded into the mate who lived closest to the school, so we could watch as much of it as possible before piling into school. But obviously the night in Cardiff, the Wales-Scotland game, marked by the sad death of Jock Stein, the shocking death of Jock Stein that evening. So even one of the two live games that we had access to was shrouded in tragedy, Chris.
It's very difficult to kind of put that into context as to, football and TV the relationship, it was no relationship where we'd had the coverage from Heysel. By some coincidence, when we had the Valley Parade fire, that was being broadcast, or certainly they had cameras there because Bradford won promotion. And this was another issue, by utterly cruel circumstances and fate. TV was now showcasing tragedy in football, and Jock Stein's passing at Ninian Park was another example of that. And again, to give you a context of how football was back then, he actually was taken ill at the end of the game. He was carried into the dressing room, and then there were about 5-10 minutes left, and Jim Rosenthal wasn't aware really of how bad things were, and he had only 10 minutes because even then there was no post-match analysis. You basically had a quick discussion and then you went on to the news, because back then nothing could interrupt news at 10 or at the 9 o'clock news on BBC. They were set in stone, and he had about 10 minutes to sum up that there'd been a football match, but actually something far worse was going on downstairs in the Cardiff dressing room, and that being the medics trying to resuscitate Jock Stein, and sadly it wasn't to be. And there we were again, talking about a live football match being the scene of not just football, but tragedy. And none of the things were related to each other, but it just went to show that the cruel nature of the period, really, and what was happening and what was being shown by TV cameras unwittingly at times, and without any fault of anyone's. In some circumstances, it just so happened to be the circumstances of that time.
Absolutely. I mean, it was a bizarre kind of era in which that type of thing transcended football as well. It was, I can remember kind of like Tommy Cooper died in front of the nation, and this is an era in which we've not got satellite television, we've not got dedicated news channels, so programs would be broken into with a news flash of some kind of horrendous event happening. Lockerbie, Marchioness, Zeebrugge. I remember all of those kind of like, there would be something quite chilling about Dallas being interrupted, by a newsreader to tell us something, horrendous that had just happened. And football, had its parts in that. And that's to say, it wasn't herded onto a news channel where you had to go and seek out that footage. We were literally subjected to it, and I think as kids, it's kind of like, wow, it's mad to think the imprint of things like that were, because they would come on screen virtually without warning. It was literally whatever you were watching would be interrupted. You get kind of like the news logo, and then there's a newsreader kind of like telling you about this horrendous thing that had happened. No, public warnings to for children to leave the room or anything like that. It was such a bizarre era in that respect. That was things eventually changed, but those months were absolutely incredible in terms of televised football. Say very, very little of it. The Daily Mirror, did come in as a saviour almost as part of this. They released a VHS video that you could buy to see.
By Robert Maxwell, of course.
Yeah, by Robert Maxwell, the man himself, who would you got this VHS video that was Brian Moore sat in a comfy chair, sharing kind of like footage that the rest of the world had been able to see. Basically, the world feed games that I was speaking of earlier, the highlights packages, and you didn't really get to kind of like there wasn't. I know from a Liverpool sporting perspective, I think there was only kind of like the game at Old Trafford. We got about 10 minutes worth of highlights out of it on that video. There seemed to be a lot. There were a lot of London-based games, put it that way, because it was obviously easier for ITV to kind of like ship cameras from LWT to kind of like Stamford Bridge, etc. I can remember kind of like Emlyn Hughes being part of that video as well and doing competitions where you could win. I don't know, ironically, a television that you needed to be able to watch this video, and we couldn't see any football on that television anyway. It is very much a bespoke era in that respect. You mentioned it earlier on the contract between 1986 and 1988. The last 2 years of the BBC ITV cartel, basically, and there was a higher number of live games. I think they both showed around about 10, 11, maybe 12 live games each a season, 86, 87, 87, 88. There was also the first broadcasting live of the Charity Shield games of 1986, Liverpool-Everton, 1987, Everton, Coventry City. I think ITV showed both of those games live. There is that first kind of post-1986 World Cup. Suddenly it's kind of like the TV channels are getting their act together. In a way, those 1986, 87 and 87, 88 seasons were kind of halcyon seasons from a UK viewer's perspective. More live football than ever before, all free to air. And, there weren't many Sundays in which there was a live game being broadcast.
It was, we were starting to see a shift in the relationship between TV and football. And what you've got to remember is that during this period, increasingly so, we're seeing owners and chairmen having sometimes quite clandestine meetings about moving forward, moving on, and breaking away, because there was still a share of broadcast rights that had to be filtered down to the other clubs in the Football League, and they weren't happy about that because, yes, the rights were going up, but they still had to share them. So I think we're seeing a shift in the relationship between football and TV, but it's not quite there yet. We're seeing out the 1980s with the companies in a better place with football, but we're seeing another player emerge. I mentioned Rupert Murdoch earlier taking over Sky, and he's now starting to build an empire at Sky Sports. And like I say, that's probably another podcast for another decade. But what we end up seeing is the transformation of football led at the front and centre by Sky Sports into the model that we have now and the incredibly lucrative product that it's created. But the late 80s and those early 90s felt very much like that transition period, really, from the mire of 1985-86, where we couldn't watch football, to better relations between the broadcasters and football, to a situation in the early 90s where Sky Sports were able to drive a coach and horses through the cartel of the BBC and ITV and actually offer something that not only was slicker, better, and probably more advanced than the BBC and ITV could offer, but they could blow them out the water, which they literally did in 1992 to secure the first rights for the Premier League. And that was a period that was to change for good. And it seems bizarre that we're talking about something that was only 6-7 years on from this particular year that we're talking about now, 85-86.
Absolutely. Probably an era in which, I don't know, television is, unremittingly beginning to milk football, from 86, 87, over those years. I think the BBC and ITV have, certainly 86 through 88 have got this product that they can milk. They've got it for cheap. But yes, going back, and within that, we'll also touch on BSB as part of this, which were the rivals to Sky, who were quicker out the block, actually, when it came to football, domestic football anyway. They would sign a contract with the BBC. We'll touch on 88, where it does begin to schism. BSB, with the Squirrels, would come into play. The summer of 88, they actually kind of like were on the brink of signing a 10-year deal with the Football League, where they were talking of subletting games to BBC and ITV. Eventually, ITV would sign an individual contract with the Football League. The BBC would team up with BSB to sign with the FA. BSB wouldn't actually get on air until, I think it was the February or March of 1990. So they would actually have, I think it was like a year and a half, best part of 2 years of having a TV contract that they could not actually kind of like broadcast any of the games. But yeah, back to 85-86, Charlton Athletic versus West Ham United was the first live game back on air. The FA Cup third round tie at Selhurst Park. The previous evening, ITV had done some limited third round highlights. Arsenal's trip to Grimsby and Aston Villa's trip to Fratton Park to take on Portsmouth. Two excellent picks, by the way. Villa had to fight for a 2-2 draw to take a replay back to Villa Park. The Arsenal game ended, I think it was 4-2. So goals aplenty. Interestingly, the BBC's coverage of the Charlton West Ham game the following day. Jimmy Hill was on the board of directors at Charlton Athletic at that point in time. So Bob Wilson fronts the coverage with Jimmy Hill there as the talking head on behalf of Charlton Athletic, intriguingly, with Trevor Brooking, the calming influence of Trevor Brooking representing West Ham. A week later, the BBC show Liverpool's trip to Watford in the league. Ironically, Liverpool and Watford at Vicarage Road would represent two of the small number of live games, with the FA Cup game that you mentioned earlier on being on ITV. So yeah, as soon as the football's back on television, it's being cranked to the max. Between January '86 and certainly April '88, when the cartel finally falls apart.
And it couldn't have come soon enough, because it was an immense finish for the title. Going into the final weekend, West Ham, Everton and Liverpool still had a chance of winning the title. It was slightly skewed by the fact that Everton and West Ham had to play after that final weekend, bizarrely. They had to play each other. So, it did go to the final weekend to all intents and purposes. We had no European football during this period, so really the only prize on offer was the top spot. And it was a great end to the season. And, by the end of 1985-86, you're almost feeling, well, it was almost like TV had never gone away, because all of a sudden we're back into the scheduling, or back into the routine of seeing football on Match of the Day, seeing the big match, seeing live football, and all the things that fall from that. All the stories, Brian Robson picking up injuries in pretty much every televised game I saw that year, Man United allowing the title to slip, finishing fourth in what should have been a one-horse race, or looked like a one-horse race for so long, Liverpool emerging to win the double, Everton, with Gary Lineker in his one season at Goodison Park, having what would otherwise have been a brilliant season, but they finished twice in both competitions to their rivals. And West Ham having a season that is still celebrated to this day by the likes of Tony Cottee, Ray Stewart, and a guy called Frank McAvenny, who we had to get to know. He came to West Ham from St Mirren, I think it was, in the summer of '85. Nobody knew who Frank McAvenny was. He was a name on the back of a newspaper, a name on CFAX, and unless you were a regular at Upton Park back then, you would not have known or seen anything of Frank McAvenny until the TV cameras finally returned.
Absolutely, and hence the BBC's choice of Charlton Athletic versus West Ham. It was an opportunity to introduce Frank McAvenny to an audience that had no idea about him. St. Greaves, going back to St. Greaves, was it Martin Tyler that took him onto London Bridge and flagged down people to see if they could identify who this mystery person was?
Well, I think the only people who knew who he was were the West Ham fans and the Page 3 girls, by all accounts. Those were the only people who knew Frank McAvenny was during that period between August and December '85. Allegedly, I should add, and that's according to one of his former teammates.
Absolutely. But yeah, like Chris said, lots of football suddenly back on the screen. The World Cup was there. BBC and ITV would still be quite circumspect in some of it. Some of those games, the 1986 World Cup, we only got to see the second half of them. The games that will kick off earlier in the evening. ITV weren't for shifting Emmerdale Farm or Coronation Street. Wogan was sacrosanct on the BBC. So, we would often be airdropped into games like Argentina versus South Korea for the second half rather than the first half. We'd get the later games would be broadcast in full. Some not even broadcast at all, because this was the last World Cup in which there were some games being played out at the same time as other matches. This is still an era in which football's governing bodies need to still sort themselves out as far as the programming football is concerned. The European Cup final was shown live as well by ITV this season. Terry Venables at the helm of Barcelona, Steve Archibald involved with them. A woeful game of football. So that was an evening when I think most of us were wishing that football wasn't on our screens. But yeah, it was very much back up and running very, very quickly. Chris, recollections of games that you were eager, delighted to watch throughout the second half of that 1985-86 season?
That's a good question. There seemed to be a lot of games between Man United and West Ham during that period. I think because they met in the FA Cup. I remember those. Brian Robson's shoulder popping out in one of those and causing issues that was to continue into the World Cup subsequently. Liverpool had a bizarre Milk Cup semi-final against QPR, where I think actually Liverpool scored 2 own goals, if I recall correctly, and got knocked out.
Yep, Steve Nicol and Gary Gillespie, I think it was. A night that was also, from a Liverpool supporting perspective, notable for the fact that Mark Seagraves played only one of his 2 games in a Liverpool shirt that night. Wow. He played at York City in an FA Cup match, and he played in the semi-final second leg of the League Cup. Never played a league game for Liverpool. Went on and served Bolton Wanderers very well, Manchester City for a while. But yeah, I think I was at that game, and there was trouble outside. About 8,000 supporters, which was suspicious of QPR, because they're not a notoriously, should we say, antagonistic football set of supporters. It was believed there were quite a lot of other West London fans from other West London clubs, shall we say, that took the opportunity to come up to Merseyside for that one and to I don't know, make themselves known, shall we say? But yeah, Liverpool scored all 4 goals in that second leg in helping QPR through to Wembley. The final itself, Oxford United 3-0 winners against QPR. An intriguing one, because Jim Smith was now the manager of QPR, the man who had guided Oxford United to promote back-to-back promotions. 80, 83, 84, third to second, 84, 85, second to first. Again, Oxford United, there's another story that television wasn't able to tell you in the early weeks of the 85, 86 season as well. Absolutely. Moving on to our "and finally" section. We have got, Chris, I sent you a link to the official singles chart. The Sunday, 5th of January 1986, this one was. It was the day of the Charlton-West Ham game. You've watched West Ham make their way through to the 4th round of the FA Cup. Switch on the radio. Presume it would have been Bruno Brooks at this point in time. What are you illegally taping from the top 40 this day?
Well, must say I'm not tempted by number 8, which is Alan Jones, Walking in the Air. I'll give a pass on that. Still a few Christmas songs loitering, shaky at number 3. I mean, I've always thought Christmas songs sound so dated by Boxing Day, but there you go. West End Girls, which I thought was an absolute brilliant song.
Yeah, it's a great. That is a great number 1, which is quite unusual, really.
It is, yeah. And Pet Shop Boys, that was probably their seminal hit. Hit That Perfect Beat by Bronski Beat, who I thought were an interesting band. I think by this point Jimmy Somerville's left, but very, very influential of its time band. Played decent pop music, but often with a more political slant or more socially aware slant, shall we say. Wham, not really for me, if I'm honest.
Yeah. Nope.
Interesting one at number 20. I was quite a big Police fan, although I was quite young at the time. But Stinger's got a song about called Russians here, which is about the strange relationship between the US and the Soviet Union, which is probably one of his better solo hits. Level 42, of course, it's the mid-80s. They're going to be there somewhere. 2 Fergal Sharkey songs. You Little Thief, I think, is the one that goes under the radar. Good Heart is the one we all know. Yeah. And just falling underneath the top 40, we've got We All Stand Together at 43 with Paul McCartney and the Frog Chorus, followed at number 44 by Run to the Hills by Iron Maiden. But I'm going to be very predictable here. Well, maybe predictable is the wrong word, but I'm going to go for the obvious tap-in here of saying that I'm going to record West End Girls because it's such a great song. And it reminds me very much of this period as well. So, I'm going to go for that one.
Excellent stuff. Shaming my brother, he had the picture disc of We All Stand Together. Right. I can vividly remember Rupert the Bear's ears. So you had the circular, of the vinyl, and then there was kind of like Paul McCartney and Rupert Bear with their arms around each other, and with kind of like Rupert's ears protruding at the top of the disc. Honourable mentions.
The Beatles could have been, yeah. Rupert.
Absolutely. John Lennon spinning in his grave in January 1986. Honourable mentions to Road to Nowhere, Talking Heads. Number
very 37.
Good. A couple of a-ha songs in the charts at this point as well. 32, Take On Me. I think the Sun Oil Shines on TV in the top 10. And you say, Fergal Sharkey at 22, 24 and 26. And Go West, Don't Look Down. The Sea.
That's a good song. Yeah, that is a good song, actually. I did consider that one. Yeah.
Yeah, but I think I don't know that top 10 apart from West End Girls and The Sun Always
There's not
Shines on
much there,
TV,
is there?
Bronx TV. It's one of those where musical democracy does not always work. Moving to the cinema, Chris, January '86. Anything stand out there that you're thinking of going and watching?
Back to the Future is still knocking around. I see. That was a fantastic film. Clue. I'm sure I saw Clue many years ago. I might be wrong.
Clue,
Down and
yeah.
Out in Down and Out in Beverly Hills, which is a cracking film. It has Talking Heads soundtrack. Once in a Lifetime. Really good film. I think I'm trying to remember who's in it, but I think Bette Midler might be in it. That rings a bell. But I think out of all of these, Chorus Line, which my daughter likes actually now, funnily enough, even though it's very much a film of 1986. Yeah, I'm going to go with Colour Purple, which I've since seen. Great film. Oprah Winfrey's big breakout film, if I recall correctly. Whoopi Goldberg, I think, might be in that. But I'm going to go with Back to the Future, which is a little bit 1985 for me, but it's still there. So I'm
It
going
is.
to claim that.
It's clearly come back for Christmas in many respects. Yeah, people are venturing out to the cinema to watch family movies there. Yeah, I'd thrown Down and Out in Beverly Hills at 22. Was one. Yeah, Clue was that based on Cluedo?
It was,
Is
yeah,
that,
yeah. Was it Tim Rice? Wasn't it? Yeah.
Tim Curry?
Tim
Tim
Curry.
Curry.
Sorry, Tim
Yeah,
Curry. Yeah,
and
yeah.
there was
I've got my
alternative.
dishes mixed up there. Yeah,
There were alternative there were alternative endings. I seem to remember to this.
that's right. Yeah.
It was such an unusual film, but I remember loving that film. Yeah, Back to the Future number 12, as you mentioned. Young Sherlock Holmes rings a bell. Number 10. I'm not watching A Nightmare on Elm Street 2.
Not for me. No.
I went to sleep tonight. Iron Eagle at number 8, which very kind of like Top Gun esque type of
Okay.
movie. Spies Like Us with Chevy Chase, I think, in that one. Spies Like Us.
That sounds. Yeah, that
And
rings a
again,
bell as well.
Paul
Yeah.
McCartney did the theme to that. Jewel in the Nile was massive. The sequel to Romance in the Stone, The Colour Purple, as mentioned. Rocky IV, Out of Africa, which was massive, a massive film that I never watched. I'd say there. The TV Guide. We will move to our fabled TV guide. The night of Saturday, the 17th of August, 1985, the first day of the football season. Liverpool are beating Arsenal 2-0 that day to kickstart their campaign to win the double. But of course, we're not going to see any of that. What are you watching, Chris? I'll give you roughly the match of the day kind of like time of day for this, and I'll mention some of the things that were on Grandstand and World of Sport as well that you can pick from as well. BBC 9:25 Shogun, Richard Chamberlain. We used to watch a lot of Shogun in our house. I seem to remember it was my brother who was into that one, so I had no real option. That was what. So I'm probably breaking out the Subbuteo pitch at this point in time. But Richard Chamberlain as the Elizabethan sailor learning to be a samurai warrior
Wow.
on a crash course to learn Japanese. And if he fails, the repercussions are massive, as a village will be burned. Following this would be the Europa Cup athletics highlights from Moscow in lieu of any other sport that we're able to watch. BBC Two, the 1965 movie King Rat, which sounds fantastic. And the good old days, which the TV Guide synopsis declares to be a series the Beeb should never have scrapped, with John Inman, Murray O'Hara and Vince Hill. On ITV, very aptly, it's Raise the Titanic, the 1980 movie. I think we're about 4 or 5 years, maybe six years away from finding out that the way that they raise the Titanic with giant balloons underneath it is actually impossible, because it's found on the foot of the Atlantic and it's actually split in half, which renders the movie kind of like the movie theory redundant. And on Channel 4, 10 o'clock, Hill Street Blues. Chris, what are you watching on the Saturday night there? We're not old enough to go to the pub.
No, I do wish I could have gone to the pub. I'm actually on this day. I remember it. I do remember this day being at my uncle's in Whitnash in Leamington Spa. We went round there, and I recall at about 4:45 asking for him to put the TV on so I could watch the results coming through. And I remember Man United, I think, won 4-0 that day. I think West Brom drew, which was their only point in the first 10 games. And I do remember it was an absolutely beautiful day. So I've got memories of that day actually in my brain still. TV-wise, not much there. I'm hoping there might be a bit of Steve Cram, Seb Coe, interest in the athletics and the Europa Cup from Russia. I think you said it was Hill Street Blues, which wasn't something I watched, but maybe I'd give it a spin.
Now, Hill Street Blues was a staple in our house. It had a magnificent theme tune to it.
It did.
And I can't remember the commander fella who had the kind of like the hat, the cap that are coveted. And I still occasionally look online to see if anyone's actually kind of like, selling one. I quite happily have one of those.
So I think it would be Hill Street Blues or the Athletics. Yeah, not much choice there. I'll give Shogun a miss, and I certainly won't be watching the Good Old Days, which sound every bit as anything but the good old days. John Inman and co. No, thank you.
Absolutely. Grandstand and the BBC. Grandstand was on air at 10:55 on this particular Saturday because of the cricket. It was the third day of the Ashes Test. They were also showing Football Focus at 1 o'clock. There was interruptions for golf at 1:10, so only Football Focus is literally lasting for 10 minutes. 1:10, 1:10, the Benson and Hedges International, which would also be shown later in the day in highlights form on the BBC, on BBC Two. Athletics, the aforementioned Europa Cup, was also interspersed with racing from Newbury as well. World of Sport, that was on air at 12:15. Yachting from the Admiral's Cup, on the ball at 12:50. To be fair, On the Ball did last for half an hour and did overlap with Football Focus on this day until 1:20. Racing from Ripon. Speedway, the World Team Cup final from California. And they also showed ITV athletics and from Moscow. Like I say, at this point in time, BBC and ITV would often show the same sporting event, not just in football terms. Like I mentioned earlier on, ITV, between 1968 and 88, for 20 years, they showed the Olympics alongside the BBC as well. Channel 4 even getting in the overnight act in 88. So yes, there are television options for Saturday the 17th of August. Finally, Chris, one last go. Give us a sporting event during the blackout that made an impression on you. Well, football couldn't make a televised impression on you. Something that you lean towards during those blackout months.
I was always a big F1 fan, and I think it was around this period where I really started to take a big interest in it because Nigel Mansell has emerged, Ayrton Senna was emerging, and actually it was during autumn of 85 Nigel Mansell won his first Grand Prix. He won the oddly named European Grand Prix, which was actually held at Brands Hatch in the UK in Kent. But I do have memories of watching that. He was driving for Williams. Ayrton Senna was driving for Lotus. And I didn't really hook into F1 properly until the following year, 86. But I do remember Mansell winning this particular race during that 85 period. And of course, the Australia-Scotland game that you mentioned earlier, which I do also remember watching bizarrely because it was one of the few games that was on. No interest in it whatsoever. I wanted Scotland to win, probably. A bit unusual to see them playing Australia for a World Cup qualifier, but watch it I did, and that's the other memory I've got.
Absolutely. Good choices. And just one quick look at the back pages. This is the Daily Mirror on the Monday of the week that the contract for football coverage was eventually signed at the end of it. It's, and earlier in that week, it's the World Cup draw, Chris. Amongst other headlines, Graham Souness has just been sent off playing for Sampdoria. He fell foul in a 2-0 win over the title-chasing Napoli. Napoli would fall short in the bid to win the title that season, but Souness has managed to get himself sent off. Terry Venables has insisted that he's remaining to see out the 3-year contract that he has with Barcelona. And it's the World Cup draw, Chris. Intriguingly, there are reports that Italian press is 24 hours before the draw is being made. They are telling all and sundry what the draw is. The English press clearly getting the wrong end of the stick and not realising that actually what we're doing here is a rehearsal for the main draw. They've taken it as some kind of conspiracy act there. But the World Cup draw, Chris, are you happy with the way that the home nations have been drawn into that 1986 World Cup earlier in that week?
Doesn't look great for Scotland, does it? Denmark, West Germany, Uruguay. Looks like
it's a tough one.
England.
I don't envy Northern Ireland having to play Spain and Brazil as well.
No, quite. That's going to be difficult. England. I'm trying to remember who else was in that Northern Ireland group, actually. Brazil.
Algeria.
Yeah, of course. England, Portugal, probably not the team they would be at that point or were going through transition. Morocco, a very unknown team.
Surely they're not going to have any problems with Morocco, Chris.
No. I think the big test will come against Poland, actually. Boniek and Urban, Zmuda, that could be the test for England. But I expect them to make light work of Portugal and Morocco. What could possibly go wrong? And of course, led by a very fit, informed Brian Robson, Ray Wilkins, a calm head, and this could be the World Cup that Kerry Dixon emerges. We shall see.
Yes, expecting big things of Mark Hateley.
Yeah, Mark Hateley, Kerry Dixon up front. It sounds like a match made in heaven.
As long as Mark Wright can remain fit and he'll be fit for the finals as well. You know, he's not going to break any legs or anything in the FA Cup semi-final. I think they'll reach the semi-finals of the FA Cup this season. Myself, where they'll inevitably go out to Liverpool. I would say maybe at White Hart Lane. I do like the look of that Denmark shirt as well for the finals. I might well invest in one of those with a number 10 on the back. Chris, thank you very much. Module 4 of our 1980s.
No problem. It's been a pleasure.
Our 1980s Odyssey has been a joy to do. Thank you so much, Chris Lepkowski. Brilliant,
thank you.
As always. And we will have you back on again very soon with another, defiantly 1980s theme. All it needs me to do is to say thank you for listening. Please do spread the word about our 1980s. This is our break off from the wonderful mothership of these football times. This is our Knots Landing, compared to the Dallas mothership in a way, or what are we, Arcadia to the Duran Duran as well. So please do spread the word. Thank you very much for listening, and please do join us again for Module 5. Thank you and goodbye.